The screaming had stopped 3 days ago. Commander Vex Carano of the Hegemony Intelligence Division stood before the reinforced containment cell, studying the broken thing that had once been human. The creature, for that's all it was now, sat motionless in the corner, arms wrapped around skeletal knees, rocking with the mindless rhythm of the completely shattered. Status report, Vex commanded, his four eyes never leaving the prisoner. Subject designate Terra 7 has experienced complete cognitive breakdown, reported his subordinate, Kish Morlick, consulting her neural pad. 73 standard cycles of enhanced interrogation, neural disruptors, molecular pain inducers, memory fragmenters, identity scramblers. We've employed every technique in the codex. Vex's mandibles clicked with satisfaction. This human had been captured during the failed Terra defense. One of their elite soldiers, their special operations units. The hegemony had spent considerable resources breaking him, extracting every scrap of tactical intelligence about human military capabilities, and the intelligence yield substantial. Troop movements, weapon specifications, command structures, defensive positions of 17 colonial worlds. Kesh's excitement was palpable. The human's entire outer rim is now exposed. The prisoner suddenly looked up, and Vex felt an unexpected chill. The human's eyes, they should have been empty, vacant pools after such extensive neural manipulation. Instead, something flickered there. Not recognition, not even basic awareness, but something deeper, primal. He doesn't even remember his own designation anymore. Kish continued, complete identity erasure. A perfect success, but Vex wasn't listening. He was studying those eyes, remembering the briefings about human psychology, their unusual attachment to individual identity, their pack-bonding behaviors. Most species, when subjected to identity fragmentation, simply cease to function. They became docile, broken shells suitable only for basic labor. Humans were different. What do we know about this specimen's background? Vex asked. Kish scrolled through her data. Standard military service record, trained in multiple combat disciplines, advanced tactical systems, xenobiology, chemical warfare protocols. She paused. Notably, he served in the colonial pacification wars, specialized in counterinsurgency operations against non-human populations. The human in the cell had begun to hum a low, tuneless sound that raised the temperature sensors. On Vex's carapace, it wasn't the mindless humming of the broken. It had structure, rhythm, purpose. Sir, Kish said, her voice suddenly uncertain, perhaps we should consider termination. The subject has served its intelligence purpose. Vex considered this. The logical course would be disposal or conversion to manual labor, but something about this human troubled him. During the interrogation sessions, even as his mind fractured and his identity dissolved, the creature had never begged, never bargained, never offered information to stop the pain. Most disturbing of all, in those final sessions before his complete breakdown, the human had begun to laugh. No, Vex decided. Transfer him to Labor Division 7, asteroid mining duty. Let him serve the hegemony in the only way his species is suited for. As they turned to leave, the humming stopped abruptly. The human's head tilted, like a predator catching an unexpected scent. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly through the cell's audio sensors. I remember recipes. Vex froze. What did he say? The human's lips curved into something that might have been a smile on a face that still retained human features for cooking, different ingredients, different temperatures, different results. Kish laughed nervously, delusional rambling. The memory fragmenters often leave random neural pathways intact. Cooking, childhood songs, mathematical formulas, meaningless fragments. But Vex felt eyes crystallizing in his thoracic cavity. He'd read the classified reports about human warfare, their peculiar talent for creative destruction, their disturbing ability to find weaknesses in systems that other species considered perfect. They called it thinking outside the box, a concept that had cost the hegemony 17 worlds. Before they learned to take it seriously, the human was still smiling, and his eyes held a clarity that shouldn't have been possible after what they'd done to him. Begin immediate transfer, Vex ordered, his voice carefully controlled, and increased security protocols around the subject, standard precautions. As they walked away, neither of them heard the human whisper to the empty cell, temperature, pressure, catalysts. I remember how it all breaks down. The broken man, who had forgotten his name, sat in the darkness, assembling fragments of memory that weren't memories of self, but of systems, biology, chemistry, physics, the fundamental building blocks of existence itself. They had shattered his identity, but in doing so, they had freed something far more dangerous than a soldier. They had created a weapon that no longer cared about surviving its own use. Labor Division 7 occupied the processed interior of asteroid XK447, a spinning rock in the neutral zone. That served as one of the hegemony's most productive mining facilities. 12,000 prisoners from 17 species worked the deep shafts, extracting rare minerals for the war effort under the watchful sensors of automated guard systems. The human designated as Labor Unit to HFY was assigned to Processing Bay, Theta, working the chemical separation units that refine raw or into military-grade materials. His immediate supervisor, a mid-tier hegemony functionary named BlackHFY, had been explicitly briefed on the prisoner's psychological profile. Complete cognitive breakdown. Thesh read from his daily roster, response to simple commands, minimal security risk, suitable for chemical handling due to species-typical resistance to toxins. The HFY stood at his assigned station, methodically sorting mineral samples. His movements were mechanical, precise, but empty of any higher cognitive function. Other prisoners gave him a wide berth. The broken ones were often unpredictable, and his particular emptiness felt different from the usual defeated resignation that permeated the facility. For 17 standard cycles, the HFY performed his duties without incident. He ate the nutrient slurry when presented. He slept in his assigned pod during rest periods. He worked the chemical separators with the mindless efficiency of a well-programmed drone. Then came the day when Supervisor Thesh decided to test the limits of his new workers' conditioning. Unit to HFY report to Processing Bay Gamma for reassignment. Thesh announced during the morning work cycle. The human looked up from his station, and Thesh was struck by how the creature's eyes seemed to focus with unexpected sharpness. For a moment, something almost like curiosity flickered there. Processing Bay Gamma handles the Xerian gas extractions, Thesh explained to his assistant, a younger hegemony bureaucrat named Veltran. Highly toxic to most species, but humans have an unusual tolerance. We can work them in those sections longer than others before they degrade. Bay Gamma was a testament to hegemony efficiency. Sealed processing chambers extracted Xerian gas from mineral compounds using high-pressure chemical baths. The gas itself was a critical component in the hegemony's most advanced weapon systems, a molecular disruptor that could destabilize the atomic bonds in enemy ship hulls. HFY stood before the control panel of Processing Unit 7, studying the readouts with what appeared to be casual interest. Thesh watched from the observation deck as the human began his work, noting the creature's unusually careful attention to the process parameters, temperature regulation, pressure differentials, catalyst introduction rates. To HFY murmured, his voice barely audible over the facilities. Ambient noise, very elegant. Thesh leaned forward. The human wasn't supposed to be capable of analytical thinking, let alone commentary on process engineering, but before he could investigate further, alarms began shrieking throughout the facility. Processing Unit 7's containment system had failed catastrophically. Xerian gas erupted from the primary chamber, flooded Bay Gamma with enough concentrated toxin to kill every prisoner in the sector. Within minutes, emergency bulkheads slammed down, sealing the contaminated area. Through the reinforced viewing port, Thesh watched in fascination as the other prisoners in Bay Gamma collapsed, their respiratory systems shutting down as the gas attacked their cellular structure, all except the HFY, who stood calmly at his station, apparently unaffected by the lethal atmosphere. How is he still alive? Velt demanded, watching the impossible scene. Human physiology, Thesh muttered, but something cold was forming in his thoracic cavity. The containment failure hadn't been random. The pressure readings showed a carefully orchestrated sequence of system overloads, the kind that required intimate knowledge of the facility's engineering systems. The human turned toward the observation deck and through the thick transparistelle, made eye contact with Thesh. The emptiness was gone from those eyes, replaced by something calculating and patient. 2847C raised one hand and pointed at the main processing console. The display showed process integration status complete. Xerian gas concentration 847% above operational parameters. System stability, critical failure imminent. Emergency teams in full environmental suits stormed into Bay Gamma, but 284-7C was already gone, vanished into the facility's maintenance conduits. Within minutes, secondary explosions began rocking the asteroid as processing units 4, 6, and 9 suffered similar containment failures, locked down the entire facility. Thesh screamed into his communicator, all prisoners to emergency containment, full security deployment, but even as he issued the orders, he could see the tactical display showing cascade failures throughout the chemical processing systems. Someone with intimate knowledge of the facility's operations was methodically triggering systematic breakdowns. The broken human who had forgotten his name moved through the facility's infrastructure like smoke, his hands working with practiced precision on systems he shouldn't have been able to understand. But the torture that had destroyed his identity had also freed his mind from the careful restrictions of military protocol and ethical constraints. He no longer remembered being a soldier, but he still knew how things broke, how systems failed, how to turn a facility's own processes against itself. In the depths of processing Bay Alpha, HFY stood before the main Xeria's storage tanks, studying the distribution network that would carry the gas throughout the asteroid's atmosphere. His broken mind had finally found its purpose not as a human, not as a soldier, but as an agent of elegant, systematic destruction. I remember recipes, he whispered to the empty chamber, his hands already moving toward the primary distribution controls. For cooking different ingredients, the hegemony had tortured him until he forgot his name. But they had made a critical error in their psychological assessment. They had assumed that breaking his identity would make him safe. Instead, they had created something that no longer cared about the consequences of absolute warfare. The asteroid facility died at stages. First, the primary life support systems began fluctuating as someone systematically corrupted the atmospheric processors. Oxygen levels dropped in critical sectors while others became oversaturated, creating explosive conditions that turned simple equipment failures into devastating chain reactions. Second, the automated security network started turning on itself. Guard drones received contradictory targeting parameters and began firing on each other in the corridors. Blast doors sealed at random intervals, trapping emergency response teams, while leaving critical areas. UNDEFE and DED. Third, the prisoners began to understand that something unprecedented was happening. Thesh stood in Emergency Command Center Alpha, watching his facility tear itself apart on the tactical displays. 17 hours had passed since the first containment failure, and they still hadn't located the human prisoner responsible for the cascade. Status report, he demanded, his voice betraying none of the growing panic that was crystallizing in his thoracic cavity. 47% of chemical processing operations offline, reported Chief Security Officer Nex Valdris, a scarred veteran of the colonial wars. 1,100 prisoners dead from various system failures, a known number of security personnel casualties, and the human, no direct visual contact. But the pattern of sabotage suggests intimate knowledge of our system's architecture. He's using our own infrastructure against us. Thesh's mandibles clicked with nervous energy. The reports he'd read about human tactical thinking had warned about their disturbing ability to weaponize environments that other species considered neutral, but those reports had described trained military personnel, not broken prisoners with shattered psyches. Sir, Valdris continued, I've analyzed the sabotage pattern. It's not random destruction, it's systematic preparation. He's creating optimal conditions for something specific. Explanation? Every action he's taken has increased atmospheric pressure in the lower levels while destabilizing the chemical storage systems. If I didn't know better, I'd say he was engineering an asteroid-wide explosion. The communication system crackled to life, and a human voice filled the command centricom, almost conversational, but carrying an undertone that made Thesh's Karapachi temperature rise. Attention Facility Command. This is, I suppose I need a designation. Let's call me Recipe. Thesh grabbed the communication array. Unit to 847C, you will cease all hostile actions and report to security for processing. Compliance will result in improved conditions. Laughter interrupted him. Not the broken cackling of madness, but the genuinely amused sound of someone who found the situation absurd. Improved conditions, the voice replied. You've already given me the ultimate improvement. You broke everything that made me care about surviving. Now I can focus purely on the work. What work? Cooking. You see, I remember fragments. Not about myself, that's gone. Thanks to your thorough efforts, but I remember techniques, procedures, how to prepare different ingredients for different results. Valdres was frantically working his console, trying to trace the signal. He's using the facility's own communication relays, jumping between nodes. I can't pin down his location, the human's voice continued, and Thesh realized with growing horror that the creature was explaining his methodology like an instructor delivering a lecture. Xerion gas makes an excellent base catalyst when properly prepared. Increase temperature, add pressure, introduce molecular oxygen at specific ratios. The reaction becomes self-sustaining once you reach critical mass. You're describing a weapon of mass destruction, Thesh said, his voice carefully controlled. I'm describing a recipe. The difference is intent, and I've forgotten how to have intent beyond the immediate task. Very liberating, actually. Valdres's eyes widened as his sensor readings updated. Sir, he's not trying to destroy the asteroid. He's trying to turn it into a bomb, the chemical composition he's creating. If it reaches critical mass, the explosion would be visible from 3-star systems. To what end? Thesh demanded into the communicator. You'll die with the rest of us, will I? I've forgotten whether that matters, but I remember that hegemony. Military doctrine places facilities like this at strategic hyperspace nodes. 17 shipping lanes converge within sensor range of this asteroid. The explosion would disrupt hegemony's supply lines throughout this entire sector. The tactical implications hit Thesh like a physical blow. This wasn't random destruction, it was strategic warfare on a scale that required detailed knowledge of military logistics and supply chain vulnerabilities. You're not broken, he whispered. You're still thinking like a soldier. No, the human replied, and his voice carried a quality that made every hegemony officer in the command center feel life forming in their organs. I'm thinking like something much worse. I'm thinking like someone who has nothing left to lose, and all the time in the universe to perfect the recipe. Explosions began echoing through the facility as processing stations throughout the lower levels started detonating in sequence, not randomly, in a carefully orchestrated pattern, designed to compress and heat the asteroid's interior. All personnel to evacuation stations. Valdres ordered, begin emergency facility abandonment. But even as the evacuation alarms began wailing, everyone in the command center understood the tactical reality. They were trapped in a closed system with a human who had been tortured, past the point of caring about consequences, who retained all his technical knowledge but none of his psychological limitations. Somewhere in the facility's depths, Recipe stood before the main Xerion distribution hub, his hands steady as he made final adjustments to the pressure systems. The broken man, who had forgotten his name, was about to remind the hegemony why humanity had been considered such a dangerous adversary. He had forgotten everything about himself, except the knowledge of how to end things completely, and for the first time since his capture. That felt like enough. The evacuation lasted 37 minutes before Recipe began killing the transports. Chief Security Officer Nex Valdres watched in horror from the primary escape pod as the human turned the asteroid's own defensive systems against the fleeing personnel. Automated defense turrets, originally designed to protect the facility from external attack, swiveled to track the departing ships. He's locked us out of our own security grid, reported systems technician Krav Hendel, frantically working his console. The targeting protocols had been completely rewritten. The first transport, carrying 47 hegemony personnel, disintegrated under concentrated plasma fire. The second managed to activate its emergency jump drive, but Recipe had anticipated this. The hyperspace disruption field around the asteroid had been modified to create unstable exit vectors. The ship emerged from hyperspace 3 seconds later as a cloud of expanding debris. How is this possible? Supervisor Thesh demanded from his position near the pod's rear compartments. The security systems require authorization codes that only senior command staff possess, Valdres finished grimly. Unless someone spent 17 hours studying our system's architecture, while we assumed he was randomly breaking things. Through the pod's viewport, they could see the asteroid itself beginning to change. What had once been a stable mining facility was now pulsing with an inner light that grew brighter. With each passing minute, sensor readings showed that the internal pressure was approaching critical thresholds. Communications array is still functional. Hendel reported, the human is broadcasting on all frequencies. Recipe's voice filled the escape pod, and Valdres noted that the human's tone had become almost conversational, like someone discussing a particularly interesting technical problem. Attention Hegemony Command. This is Recipe, formerly Unit to 847C, reporting mission status. I've successfully converted mining facility XK447 into a directed energy weapon system, with an estimated yield of 47 megatons. Current countdown to critical mass for hours, 12 minutes. Valdris grabbed the communication system. Unit to 847C, I am Chief Security Officer Valdris. Your tactical objective is unclear. This facility contains no strategic value that would justify. Wrong. The human interrupted. This facility contains me, and I have strategic value that your people didn't consider when they decided to perfect their interrogation techniques. Explain. I remember serving in the colonial pacification wars, specialized operations against non-human populations, but I don't remember why I was there, or who I was fighting for, or what the moral justification might have been. I just remember the technical skills. Valdris felt his carapace temperature drop. What are you saying? I'm saying that your psychological reconstruction was imperfect. You removed my identity, my emotional attachments, my ethical constraints. But you left me with detailed knowledge of how to conduct asymmetric warfare against non-human species. Congratulations, you've created the perfect xenocide specialist. The tactical display showed 17 more hegemony vessels approaching the asteroid. A full evacuation fleet dispatched from the nearest military installation. A Recipe had been monitoring their communications, and he was ready. Observe, he said calmly. The asteroid's modified defensive systems opened fire on the approaching fleet with devastating precision. But these weren't random attacks. Recipe was demonstrating intimate knowledge of hegemony's ship design, targeting specific vulnerabilities that no prisoner should have been able to identify. The flagship's primary reactor went critical after a single shot to its thermal regulation system. The destroyers lost navigational control when their sensor rays were surgically disabled by weapons fire that avoided their heavily armored sections entirely. A transport filled with evacuation personnel found itself trapped in a carefully constructed crossfire pattern that made escape impossible without sacrificing the surrounding ships. He's not just using our weapons, Valdris realized with growing horror. He's using them better than we do. Impossible. Tesh protested. He's a broken prisoner with no military training, no identity. Recipe's voice corrected through the communicator. But plenty of training. The techniques I used to break non-human resistance during the colonial wars translate quite well to breaking non-human military formations. Valdris understood then what they were facing. The hegemony's interrogation methods had been designed to break human identity while preserving useful skills. They had succeeded to well creating a tactical intelligence that retained all its lethal capabilities while losing every psychological limitation that might have constrained its use. What do you want? Valdris asked. Want implies desire, and desire requires identity. I don't want anything. I'm simply executing the logical conclusion of my current tactical situation, which is, I'm a weapon that's been pointed at your species and then activated. The fact that I don't remember who pointed me doesn't change the fundamental equation. The asteroid's internal light was becoming visible to the naked eye, pulsing with a rhythm that suggested imminent catastrophic failure. Sensor readings showed that Recipe had managed to create a carefully controlled fusion reaction, using the facility's chemical processing systems and improvised stellar weapon that would announce its detonation across multiple star systems. Final communication, Recipe announced to any hegemony command authority monitoring this frequency. You have successfully created a xenocidal weapon with no behavioral constraints and no survival instinct. I suggest you consider this when designing future interrogation protocols. Wait, Valdris called desperately. There must be something we can offer. Improved conditions, medical treatment, restoration of your identity. I don't want to be restored, Recipe replied, and his voice carried a finality that made the escape pods occupants feel like they were listening to their own death sentence. I like what you've made me. For the first time since my capture, I feel efficient. The communication channel went silent. Through the viewport, they could see the asteroid beginning to collapse inward as Recipe initiated the final phase of his improvised stellar weapon. Valdris looked at the tactical display showing the 17 destroyed or crippled vessels, the hundreds of dead hegemony personnel, and the growing energy signature that would soon announce humanity's capacity for absolute retaliation across half the galaxy. The broken human, who had forgotten his name, was about to remind the hegemony why they had been afraid of his species in the first place, and he was going to do it by demonstrating that sometimes the most dangerous weapon was someone who had been given nothing left to lose. Fleet Admiral Corix Valthan of the Hegemony 4th Battle Group received the distress beacon 18 minutes before asteroid HFY achieved critical mass. His response was immediate and overwhelming. 4 to 7 warships, 300 fighter craft, and 12,000 elite naval personnel converging on coordinates. That intelligence report contained one broken human prisoner. Status report: Valthan commanded from the bridge of his flagship, the Dreadnought Inexorable Conquest. Asteroid facility has been converted to an improvised stellar weapon. Reported Tactical Officer Yex Morvain. Internal fusion reaction approaching. Critical threshold. Estimated detonation yield 47 megatons. Sufficient to disrupt shipping lanes throughout this sector. And the human, still broadcasting from the facility interior. He's giving us technical specifications. Valthan's eyes narrowed. Explain. Recipe's voice filled the bridge. Calm and instructional. Hegemony Fleet Command. This is a recipe. I'm transmitting complete technical data on the weapon system I've constructed. You'll note the elegant simplicity standard mining equipment repurposed, using principles of controlled fusion catalysis. Why? Valthan demanded into the communicator. Professional courtesy. Your people are about to die, but they should understand how. It's a respect issue. The tactical display showed the approaching detonation timeline. 2 hours, 43 minutes, enough time for a full-scale assault. But the asteroid's modified defensive systems were already engaging the fleet's outer perimeter with devastating effectiveness. Fleet deployment Omega-7. Valthan ordered. All ships, prepare for siege bombardment. Target the asteroid's surface installations and dig that human out. The first wave consisted of 12 heavy cruisers, their plasma batteries charging for concentrated surface bombardment. A recipe had spent 34 hours studying hegemony military doctrine through the facility's databases, and he was ready. The asteroid's defenses opened fire with surgical precision, not the overwhelming barrage that conventional tactics would suggest, but carefully targeted shots that exploited specific vulnerabilities in hegemony ship design. The cruiser Relentless Dominion lost its primary shields when a single plasma bolt severed its power relay coupling. The crushing Victory found its navigation systems disabled by weapons fire that somehow penetrated its heavily armored command section. He's not fighting like a desperate prisoner, Morvain observed, watching the tactical display with growing unease. He's fighting like he knows exactly how our ships work. Impossible. Human military technology is inferior to ours, sir. With respect, he's not using human technology. He's using ours, and he's using it better than we do. The second wave launched. 36 fighter craft in attack formation, intending to overwhelm the asteroid's point defense systems through sheer numbers. Recipe met them with a demonstration of tactical innovation that would be studied in military academies for generations. Instead of engaging the fighters directly, he turned the asteroid's mining equipment against them, or processing lasers, normally used to cut through solid rock, became precision weapons that could slice through fighter armor at unprecedented ranges. Magnetic ore separators became electromagnetic pulse generators that disabled fighter squadron electronics without warning. Within 17 minutes, 29 fighters were destroyed or crippled. The survivors retreated, their pilots reporting impossible accuracy from defensive systems that shouldn't have been capable of tracking fast-moving targets. This is Admiral Valthan to all fleet units. The commander broadcast, "We are facing an enhanced threat scenario. The human has demonstrated capabilities beyond our intelligence assessments. Adjust tactics accordingly." Recipe's voice interrupted the transmission. "Admiral Valthan, I suggest you withdraw your fleet immediately. Not from concern for your personnel. I've forgotten how to care about enemy casualties, but because you're about to witness something that will fundamentally alter hegemony military doctrine. Explain. I'm going to demonstrate what happens when someone with intimate knowledge of non-human biology gains access to military-grade chemical processing systems." The asteroid began releasing gas clouds into local space, not the explosive Zarian compounds that intelligence had predicted, but something far more sophisticated. Sensor analysis showed complex molecular structures, designed specifically to interact with hegemony physiology. "Biological warfare," Morvain whispered. He's created a species-specific toxin. The first ship to encounter the expanding cloud was the destroyer Ultimate Retribution. Within minutes, its crew began experiencing systemic organ failure. Emergency life support protocols activated automatically. But the toxin had been designed to circumvent standard countermeasures. All ships, emergency withdrawal to safe distance. Valthan ordered full biological contamination protocols, but Recipe had anticipated this response. The asteroid's final modification revealed itself as the gas cloud suddenly ignited, creating a controlled chemical explosion that accelerated the toxin's dispersion throughout local space. What had been a localized threat became an expanding sphere of death that threatened the entire fleet. He's turned the entire asteroid into a chemical weapon, Morvain reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Species-specific biological warfare on an unprecedented scale. Ships throughout the fleet began reporting casualties as the engineered toxin reached their positions. Emergency decontamination procedures proved ineffective. Recipe had designed his weapon with intimate knowledge of hegemony biological systems and military countermeasures. The cruiser Inexorable Justice lost 50% of its crew before its captain ordered emergency hyperspace jump. The fighter squadron Omega Delta ceased communications entirely. Transport vessels carrying evacuation personnel from the original mining facility found themselves trapped in an expanding cloud of death specifically tailored to their species. Fleet casualties approaching 30%, Morvain reported. Sir, we need to withdraw immediately. But Admiral Valthan was studying the tactical display with the expression of someone who finally understood the true scope of the threat. He's not just attacking our fleet. He's conducting a demonstration, sir. Every action he's taken has been transmitted on open frequencies. Every technique he's used has been carefully documented and broadcast throughout hegemony space. He's teaching any listening enemy exactly how to conduct species-specific warfare against us. Recipe's voice filled the bridge one final time. Hegemony. Command. This concludes the tactical demonstration. You now have complete technical specifications for converting standard industrial facilities into xenocidal weapon systems. I recommend you consider this information when planning future operations against human populations. The asteroid achieved critical mass 4 to 7 seconds later, its destruction visible from 6 star systems and marking the location where one broken human had reminded the galaxy that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology, it was their willingness to become something terrible when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The explosion that consumed asteroid XK for 147 sent gravitational shockwaves through hyperspace, triggering automated distress beacons across 17 star systems. Within hours, both Hegemony High Command and the remaining human colonial governments received detailed technical specifications for the improvised stellar weapon, along with complete documentation of Recipe's species-specific biological warfare techniques. The response was swift and terrifying. Hegemony Supreme Commander Zeph Korthik stood in the primary war room of Capital Station Omega, studying intelligence reports that painted a picture of strategic catastrophe. The human prisoner's demonstration had not only destroyed a critical mining facility and eliminated an entire battle fleet, but had also revealed vulnerabilities in hegemony military doctrine that their enemies were already exploiting. Status of Colony World 7 through 23. He demanded, under siege. Reported Intelligence Director Vash Melthan. Human resistance cells have begun implementing the chemical weapon techniques broadcast from XK447. Standard industrial facilities on 12 worlds have been converted to biological warfare production and centers. Casualties approaching the million hegemony personnel. The humans have refined the original toxin design, creating variants specifically tailored to different hegemony subspecies. Korthak's mandibles clicked with frustrated rage. One broken prisoner had single-handedly provided humanity with the tools to conduct systematic genocide against its species, and our countermeasures ineffective. The human designated as Recipe possessed detailed knowledge of our biological systems that we didn't know he had. Every countermeasure we deploy, they've already found ways to circumvent, but the true strategic disaster was yet to be revealed. Long-range sensors detected massive human fleet movements throughout the outer colonies, not the desperate defensive actions of a losing war, but coordinated offensive operations that suggested systematic preparation. Sir, Melthan continued, we're receiving communication requests from the Human Command Authority. They claim to have Terms for discussion. Terms. Korthak's voice carried deadly calm. They are in no position to negotiate terms. Sir, with respect, the tactical situation has fundamentally changed. Recipe's demonstration has provided them with weapons capabilities that threaten our core worlds. The communication system activated, and a human voice filled the war room, not the broken emptiness of Recipe, but the controlled authority of someone accustomed to strategic command, Hegemony's supreme command. This is Admiral Marcus Fenwick of the Colonial Defense Force. I believe we need to discuss recent developments. There is nothing to discuss, Korthak replied. Your species will surrender unconditionally or face complete extermination. I don't think you understand your current position, Fenwick said calmly. The individual you designated as Recipe has provided us with complete technical specifications for conducting species-specific warfare against your populations. More importantly, he's demonstrated that your interrogation techniques create rather than eliminate strategic threats. Explain. We've analyzed the psychological profile of the prisoner you broke on HFY. Your methods removed his identity and ethical constraints while preserving his technical knowledge. You essentially created a xenocidal specialist with no behavioral limitations. Korthak felt eyes forming in his thoracic cavity. What are you saying? We're saying that we have 743 prisoners of war in our custody, all of whom have been subjected to similar interrogation techniques, all of whom have forgotten their original identities while retaining detailed knowledge of hegemony military systems, biology, and strategic vulnerabilities. The tactical implications hit Korthak like a physical blow. You're threatening to use our own broken personnel against us. We're informing you of our enhanced strategic capabilities. Would you like a demonstration? Before Korthak could respond, alarm systems throughout Capital Station Omega began shrieking. The station's internal atmosphere was being systematically contaminated with a biological agent that attacked hegemony respiratory systems with devastating efficiency. How? Melton gasped. Even as emergency life support protocols activated throughout the command center, hegemony Prisoner 847 Alpha was transferred to this station's labor division 6 months ago, Fenwick explained conversationally. Your interrogation techniques left him with detailed knowledge of your station's life support systems and no psychological barriers against using that knowledge. He's been preparing this demonstration for quite some time. Through the command center's reinforced viewports, they could see hegemony personnel collapsing throughout the station's corridors. As the engineered toxins spread through the atmosphere, emergency evacuation procedures were useless. The contamination had been introduced directly into the primary life support systems. Consider this a limited demonstration, Fenwick continued. We have similar assets positioned at strategic locations throughout hegemony space. Broken prisoners who remember how to break systems, but have forgotten why they shouldn't. What do you want? Korthak demanded, even as his own respiratory system began showing signs of toxin exposure, complete withdrawal from all human colonial territories, reparations for war damages, and most importantly, immediate cessation of all interrogation activities against human prisoners. Impossible. Then I suggest you prepare for the systematic collapse of your civilization, because the prisoners you've broken don't just remember military techniques. They remember how entire species can be eliminated using readily available industrial resources. Korthak looked at the tactical displays showing contamination spreading throughout his flagship station, at the casualty reports flooding in from 12 colony worlds, at the strategic assessments that painted a picture of systematic vulnerability. The humans had turned the hegemony's own methods against them with devastating effectiveness. You have 6 hours to begin withdrawal procedures, Fenwick announced. After that, we begin phase 2 of the demonstration. What's phase 2? 743 broken prisoners, each assigned to a different hegemony installation, each with detailed knowledge of how to convert industrial facilities into species-specific weapons. They've forgotten their names, their histories, their reasons for restraint, but they remember recipes. The communication channel closed, leaving the hegemony command staff to contemplate a strategic nightmare of their own creation. They had tortured humans until they forgot their identities, believing this would make them safe. Instead, they had created an army of xenocidal specialists with no psychological limitations and intimate knowledge of hegemony vulnerabilities. For the first time in the war, Korthak found himself considering the possibility that his species might not survive their own victory. 3 standard years after the HFY incident, The broken man who had once called himself Recipe stood in the observation deck of Colonial Station Meridian, watching hegemony transport ships departing from the last occupied human world. The war was over, ended not by massive battles or heroic sacrifices, but by the systematic application of strategic terror. He still couldn't remember his original name, his family, or the life he lived before captivity. The hegemony's interrogation techniques had been thorough in their destruction of his identity, but in the aftermath of humanity's victory, he had discovered something unexpected. He no longer wanted to remember. "Status report," said the woman who stood beside him, Admiral Sarachan, commander of the Colonial Defense Force and the architect of humanity's psychological warfare campaign. "Final hegemony withdrawal completed 17 minutes ago," Recipe replied, his voice still carrying the empty precision that had made him so effective as a weapon. "No resistance, no delayed tactics. They're abandoning the sector entirely, and the other assets? 743 former prisoners, all successfully integrated into post-war reconstruction efforts. Turns out that detailed knowledge of alien technology and complete lack of ethical constraints makes for very effective industrial engineers." Chen studied his profile, noting the absence of satisfaction or triumph that should have accompanied such a comprehensive victory. Recipe had become something beyond human emotion, a perfect instrument of strategic destruction that had achieved its purpose and now existed in a state of purposeless efficiency. "The psychological evaluation teams want to attempt identity restoration," she said carefully. "Dr. Martinez believes that with advanced neural reconstruction, we might be able to recover some of your original personality patterns." Recipe turned to look at her, and Chen felt the familiar chill that came from looking into eyes that held intelligence without identity, knowledge without attachment. "Why would I want that?" he asked with genuine curiosity. "Because you were human. Once. You had a life, relationships, dreams that went beyond tactical destruction. I was also limited by those things, constrained by moral considerations that prevented optimal strategic thinking. The hegemony did me a favor by removing those limitations." Chen had heard similar responses from other broken prisoners who had been instrumental in humanity's victory. The interrogation techniques that had been intended to destroy human resistance had instead created a cadre of individuals who combined human ingenuity with complete absence of ethical restraint, perfect weapons for conducting asymmetric warfare against a technologically superior enemy. "Don't you want to know who you were?" she pressed. Recipe considered this for a long moment, watching the last hegemony ship disappear into hyperspace. "I remember fragments, a woman's laugh, the taste of something called coffee, the feeling of sunlight on skin, but those memories belong to someone else, someone who couldn't do what needed to be done. And what needed to be done? Species-level strategic deterrence. The hegemony needed to understand that humanity could become something worse than they were. If pushed beyond acceptable limits, the person I used to be couldn't have provided that lesson." Chen found herself both fascinated and disturbed by Recipe's perspective. He spoke of genocide and strategic terror with the same detachment that others might discuss weather patterns or agricultural yields. "So what happens now?" she asked. "The war is over. Your strategic purpose has been fulfilled. Now, I help rebuild. The same knowledge that allowed me to break hegemony systems can be used to improve human infrastructure, industrial processes, defensive installations, technological development, all very similar to the work I did during the war, just with different objectives, and you're satisfied with that." Recipe smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be warm and completely empty at the same time. Satisfaction implies emotional investment. "I don't have emotions in the traditional sense anymore, but I have purpose. A purpose is sufficient." As they spoke, construction crews throughout the liberated colonies were implementing designs created by Recipe and others like him. Advanced defensive systems based on hegemony technology, but improved through human innovation. Industrial facilities that could be rapidly converted to weapons production if needed. A civilization that had been refined through strategic trauma into something capable of absolute warfare when necessary. "There's something else," Chen said. "Intelligence reports suggest that other species in the galaxy have taken note of our methods. Several governments are requesting detailed briefings on psychological warfare techniques. They want to know how to break their enemies the way we were broken, or how to avoid being broken themselves." Recipe nodded with professional interest. A logical response. The HFY demonstration proved that conventional interrogation methods can create, rather than eliminate, strategic threats. Any competent military organization would want to understand the implications. Are you willing to share that knowledge? Of course, information wants to be used, and strategic knowledge has no moral constraints. Besides, he added with that empty smile, teaching others how to create weapons like myself seems like an elegant form of revenge against the concept of traditional warfare. Chen watched him for a moment longer, recognizing that she was looking at humanity's future, not the idealistic vision of peaceful cooperation that pre-war philosophers had imagined, but something harder and more pragmatic, a species that had learned to weaponize its own suffering to turn psychological trauma into strategic advantage. One final question, she said, do you ever regret what you've become? HFY considered this with the same analytical precision he applied to all problems. Regret requires emotional attachment to alternative outcomes. I can't regret becoming an effective weapon any more than a hammer can regret not being a screwdriver. I am what the situation required me to be. He turned back to the viewport, watching human ships moving through space that had been occupied by enemies just hours before. The hegemony tortured me until I forgot my name. But they made a critical error in their methodology. They assumed that breaking someone's identity would make them safe. Instead, they created something that remembered how to end entire species and forgot why that might be wrong. As the transport ships disappeared into hyperspace and the liberated worlds began their reconstruct, HFY stood in the observation deck, no longer human in any meaningful sense, but still serving humanity's strategic interests with perfect, emotionless efficiency. The war was over, but the galaxy would never again make the mistake of assuming that breaking humanity would make them harmless. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing you could do to a human was take away everything that made them human and leave them with all the knowledge of how to fight back. HFY had forgotten his name, but he had remembered something far more important: how to ensure that his species would never be victims again. And in a universe where survival often required becoming something terrible, that knowledge was worth more than any individual identity could ever be.